Hi, everyone. Welcome to Rambling About AI, episode 11. And we're really excited today because we're going to talk about the great vibe code cleanup. So yeah, it's something that's been. We were like, well, what are you going to talk? What are we going to talk about today? And it's been happening in my last few weeks. It's been happening for me. I've been doing a lot of cleanup, and they talk about it a lot on LinkedIn. Everyone's saying, you see these companies emerging saying they're actually selling the services, consultancy service to fix stuff that's been vibe coded. It's this new thing. I mean, it's a lot of senior engineers are saying this was going to happen, and it is actually happening now. And I'm even doing it myself. So yeah, I think we're going to talk a little bit about the impact now because we're seeing the impact of vibe coding.
Yeah.
So what do you want to? Yeah, what do you?
Well, I think you're starting to see now some real concrete examples of these are the kind of things you can approach with vibe coding that are going to cause a problem at a certain point. It was always a sense when we talked about this that the way they create code is not designed for long-term maintainability. But you can say that with also not necessarily being able to describe exactly the mechanism that happens. Like, does it mess up the data model? Does it mess up the architecture? Does it mess up the performance? But I think now we're getting like a better sense of that. And so I think now is a good time to just jam on like where are people making mistakes with vibe coding, and then where are we finding the most opportunity to clean it up? Sometimes using some of the same tools, but just having like a different perspective on it that somebody like us can.
Yeah, it's funny because like even though these models are getting smarter and smarter and smarter, the problem still remains. And actually, you nailed it the other day. I was explaining about how an AI is never gonna look back at all your work and stop itself and say, "Oh, hang on. I just added over the last 2 weeks. I've added like 20 navigation items, and it's never gonna stop and say, I'm gonna pause for a minute here and I'm going to go back and look at this and say, hang on, we got to pause because this is getting bloated. And you made a good observation. You said it doesn't go backwards or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
It
doesn't.
doesn't go backwards. It's one of those almost terms of phrase or ways of thinking about it that end up coming in handy a lot when you're thinking about how you interpret the way it happened. And that's one is like you as the designer, you can take things out of the context. You can force it to forget. But the normal mode of operation is not that. It remembers everything in the conversation that you're happening. And so to the extent that that sends it down a direction that you didn't end up being on, there's not a lot you can do except for almost going backwards. And that reflection of like, you go forward for a while until you kind of get stuck. And then you come back. But you don't go back to zero, right? You come back sort of far enough that you can recenter yourself. So in that scenario, the menu items have become overcomplicated, right? If you just keep asking the LLM, right, it's just going to keep asking more menu items. If you say start over, who knows what you're going to get? But if you say, hey, go back and start the menu over, that part of it over, it's your like when you're bringing to the table in terms of how far back you have to go in order to recover from this design hole that you put yourself in. That's maybe a good example of this. Is like you just keep going, you just keep going, you just keep going. But now you get that you've gone too far. But at the same time, you don't know how far back you've got to go to reorient yourself. And that dynamic has to play out.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously, we've been doing this like 15, 20 years. So we've been through this whole cycle of seeing like software engineering and how it used to be done versus how it's done now. And then you've got these young people coming in and they're just vibe coding stuff, thinking it's awesome. And then obviously the older jaded people are looking back and saying, hang on, son, you don't know what you're doing. That's right.
No, they're both. I mean, they're both. That's the thing. That's what makes this whole thing hard. They're both absolutely right. Like
Absolutely
it
right.
is. It is both awesome, and you can do things you've never done before. But also, it's dangerous, and it doesn't create a sustainable code. And it's like arguing about which side of that you're on is not nearly as interesting as saying like, yeah, but okay, where does it excel, and where do people cause problems when you're doing it? There's so many of these when you look back at the project and you're trying to sort of assess where am I wrong, that you go back to a point somewhere along the way and you say there was a mistake there, and it would have been easy to see at the time, but you weren't looking because the vibe code was going right. It was just vibing, so you missed it. If you'd have caught it, you could have saved yourself weeks of work because it wouldn't have kept iterating on the same underlying error. But you can check everything that it does. So how do you find the balance? And I think it's a lot easier to point to the problem because we can see it in retrospect. You can see it. Much more difficult to describe it when you're in that moment of like, when should you have checked? How far should you have let it go? And that is a very, very different.
It's funny how today I actually had an experience where because as you know, like with vibe coding, we're talking about maybe a year ago, the models were so much not as good. I mean, Sonnet, I don't know, 3 point whatever it was. I can't even remember a year ago, but the stuff that was getting vibe coded at the time probably wasn't that great. And now when you vibe code with Opus 4.8, it's generally pretty good. You can trust what it builds. But even today, as I'm sure a lot of people found, Claude was down for like 2 hours, and of course the world stops. Claude is down. It was sorry, Opus 4.8 was down to be specific. So of course the whole world crashes, and everyone's like having to dust off their JavaScript books, and
For one day.
for one day. But
Yeah.
yeah, I was like, okay, well I'll switch back to using Sonnet 4.6. I can't remember which one it went back to, and yeah, I was just doing the same thing I was doing. Obviously, I had the same context loaded, everything, so it should have just picked up and carried on. And you could tell, and there was a noticeable difference between Opus and Sonnet, and just how he was talking, how he was thinking. You could watch the reasoning, and you could be like, "Why is it doing that?" I was like, "Okay, well, I'll just run with it." And it was making stupid decisions. Like, for example, it was deciding that it wasn't going to put something in the nav, and its reasoning was like, "Well, the user can just go directly to that page. They have it in their bookmarks or something." I'm like, "Whoa, hang on a second! You're going to basically make your user go to a direct link as opposed to having it in the navigation." And it was making these calls and making these very strange decisions about things. And yeah, it wasn't doing it right. And then I had to, when Opus came back online, I had to check its work. Mostly it was fine. But the point I'm making is that, when stuff was vibe coded a year ago, it definitely needs to be checked, because it isn't as good as it is now.
Yeah.
So things are obviously changing, between code that was created a year ago and maybe needs cleaning up to work that's maybe being created now. Does it need as much cleanup? Who knows?
It's a lot of it's just about pushing that boundary down the line because, you know, one way of describing the models getting better is that you can express what you want to them and they will hold that in their memory longer without having to sort of be redirected and go directed. Like you probably would have said somewhere in the prompt, I want you to make sure that they navigate to everywhere, right? You would have said that. But the longer and longer it goes, the less semantic weight that those words hold way back in the context. Why even cut it out by now, right? So like it's easy to kind of forget it. And having that sense of like, what do I need to keep reiterating to it versus what is sort of just incidental to the task that's on now? It's kind of like managing the context yourself. And there
There
is
is
a
a
skill
skill.
set.
And I think, again, I'm not an expert in terms of how the models work, but I think memory recall, I would imagine, is probably a lot better in Opus because you can save a ton of memories into its memory bank, which I think is like 26 kilobytes or something like that.
Yeah.
But you can it's an index file, but you can have so many files indexed. So you could have a design system as a memory. And then, so for example, you could say something like always make sure pages all have navigation items, for example. So Opus would be like, oh, well, of course I'm going to create a navigation item because I can see that in the memory in the context because it has that 1 million, 2 million, whatever token context.
Yeah.
Whereas Sonnet maybe doesn't index those memories and therefore just forgets about that kind of thing. So even that, like you say, context is a huge part of a newer model, which is going to affect vibe coded projects.
The longer term context, just having the window be so much wider that you don't have to do so much pre processing. I think, if anything, that just allows you to move that much faster as a developer because you kind of just kick the can down the road in terms of when you have to start obsessing about the context. You will eventually when you've got a million, that's a lot. It's like a novel. Like it's hard to put a million word context in unless you're just literally querying a database with way more than a million and filtering it down to something close to a million. That's about the only way you get to a million context, other than just filling it up after a long chat. So I think you're seeing those two use cases align amongst the idea that more context is better, therefore more context. But we aren't as good at dealing with that long context. We know that the more it has in the context, the less it can pay attention to any given part of that. It's just sort of a function of how the numbers work. But exactly how that works, is it even across it? I remember some studies early on saying it was more likely to forget something in the middle of the context window than it was around the end because language, like, as you focus, so kind of learn that. Is that still true? Used to be the give it a persona, and that was the only way to get it to like think like this, like reorienting the probabilities. Now you don't have to do that. You just sort of say that. So it's hard to know how much these heuristics we develop, like to do our job to get through things, end up themselves being challenged so quickly that you almost don't have time to turn it into best practice. You don't have time to make podcasts. before it's different. And if you're hurting people by sharing that information, because we know that any information you add to the prompt that isn't relevant for the task, it lowers the quality. And so if there was information that you used to have to add in that you don't anymore, then if you're still adding it in, you're hurting the performance when you do that. So how do you know that transition happened? And when you make that call from adjusting the code, is that's the like meta version of how do you do good vibe coding? How is the model's ability to do vibe coding changing over time? And it's very difficult to know that as observers.
Yeah. I think it would be good to talk about a little about like maybe if you're not if you're listening to this podcast and you're not like a technical developer or whatever, maybe you've hired someone, an agency or a developer to build something for you. Most likely in the last year or so, they've probably vibe coded it. Most likely, unless it's a traditional development firm and they're charging you six figures to build a project, most likely it's going to be been vibe coded or certainly used AI tools to build a lot of the code base. If it was your nephew or your son or something, it's like, yeah, I could build that out for you and tonight in a couple of hours. Definitely vibe coded. But yeah, if you're someone that's looking at this and you've asked someone to build a project or you have asked someone to build a project, how would you say, like, what would you say to them in terms of like, should they feel comfortable? Like, should they be hiring another agency to fix their code? Like, what's your take on that?
So that's another one where like the tape's kind of evolved, right? And you used to just be able to say, there's no way. And then it got a lot better. And then it's like, maybe. But I think you still have to approach it as like, look, you probably got a pretty good idea what you want to build. So whatever you're going to give to a development shop, they're probably going to use a lot of the same tools. So you should just take your idea and give it to Claude and see what Claude builds. Not because that's the answer, because you want to see what it's going to do. That'll allow you to assess the quality of what somebody else gives you. Because if they give you literally what Claude did, then you know that they I think you should see what Claude's going to do. I think the trap people fall into is they have an unreasonable expectation of what it's going to be able to do for them. They're focused on the visual experience, which it's very, very good at. But it's also very good at thinking everything behind the visual experience. So if I was going to tell somebody, and then like I had this idea, should I do vibe code? I mean, you should absolutely pay for the $20 a month one. That'll get you enough to vibe code whatever you need in one sense. And then when you get to the end of it and you like it, then go back to Claude and say, okay, now I'm going to make this a thing. This has got to be real. There's got to be a real database. It's got to be real users. It's got to be real logins. It's got to be real servers. It's got to be real. What needs to happen between now and it being real? And let Claude tell you that. And if you know what it's talking about, then you're fine. But if you don't know what it's talking about, then you need to hire somebody because the hard part is not the stuff that you did with Claude. The hard part is all that other stuff that you're still going to have to do. And unless Claude can do all that, which it does get more and more better about that every year, but once it starts relying on CLIs to do things, it'll start getting real hairy. Not because the CLIs can't do it, because you constantly have to reauthorize them. You constantly have to remember which combination. Is that OAuth? Is it this other thing? And you're having to answer all these questions that the AI can't really know because it requires access to services that it doesn't have all the time. And so you have to get a different heuristic than you used to, which is it sounds hard. That's why you would call a developer. Now you have to kind of do it and then ask Claude, is it going to be hard? And it'll tell you.
Yeah, and that happened the other day. One of my friends called me from England, and he was like, "Hey, my friend wants to build this app that does a certain thing," and obviously, I'm thinking, oh, I could probably build that for him, and I'm doing dollars in my head how much it's going to cost. I'm like, he's not. He's just an experiment for him. He doesn't want to spend $50,000. Not to say that that's what it would cost, but he doesn't want to spend anything on it really. Probably maybe a few $100. And I was already stopping myself and thinking, okay, I think the best thing he should do is probably just build it himself. Go for it. And I said, I'm sure he's capable. Even Claude code these days is very easy to install. You don't even need to like use you don't have technical ability really. You just download it. And I was suggesting that he goes ahead and does that. And my friend was like, could he actually build an iOS app on his phone and actually get it working? I was like, well, yeah, he can. It does everything now. He should build it and have a play with it. But I said to him though, I think you're going to have the problem though, when you get to that point of where you need to do all the stuff that you do after you've built the apps, like you've got to get Xcode, you've got to compile it, you've got to get on the App Store, you've got to look at all their guidelines and how you actually developer accounts, sandboxes, railway, or Amazon, points, environment variables, all that stuff. And Claude will help you to a degree. And yeah, as you say, you can have CLIs, which are command line interfaces, which means you can just do things from Claude code and it can actually deploy something to a server. But you have to have an API key. You have to have all these things, which as developers, we're like, oh yeah, we got that. That's easy, super easy for us. But for someone who's maybe technical in the sense of being able to know what they want to build, but isn't technical in the sense of I know that about API keys and setting up, and also the time too, like the amount of time it takes to do that. As for us, let alone someone that doesn't know, is probably days. It maybe take us 2 hours to set up a deployment environment. Take them to research everything, probably 2 days just to research, do it all. They don't want to spend all that time doing that point. So I think you find that scenario happens where you've got the lovable product, you've got the built vibe coded product that runs on your machine or your phone, and then you get to that 80%, and then you're like, I don't want to do the rest, and I'm going to hire someone to finish it off. So then you have that situation where they don't want to continue because they've kind of hit the end of their, they got tired and they're done, right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm guessing would have happened with my friend's project.
Yeah, you see that play out. I think when people use the term AI psychosis from like an executive level, is it's almost like what we said originally was don't do it, right? Trust your developers. It's great to prototype with them, but you're not going to be able to just use it. And what happened was the executives didn't care. They either didn't care that you were saying that, or they just would believe Sam Altman, or they believe the guy at the country club that played golf with them that said they vibe code an app for their kids. Whatever, right? It didn't work. So the answer is not that to continue to say that. The answer is to say fine, but there's one more step to take. And I think you added another level on this, and then there's probably almost like a skill at this, which is like it's vibe code. What now? And I think if those executives that were in there going, "Oh, I vibe coded this, so I gave it to my CEO, so do I get business that way?" If they had followed it up by saying, "I'm the CEO of this. I have this much time available. I have this much money available. I have these resources available. What will it take to turn this into an actual product my computer uses, my company uses?" And they look down that list. I think it would solve their psychosis real quick. But because there's so many experience with it, they just don't think to do that unless we share something like that with them.
Another great application to all this vibe coding, if you're not a technical or a developer, is prototyping. So this happened in a project I was working on. One of the stakeholders, we're trying to gather requirements. What do they want to build? And one of the stakeholders knew enough about Claude Code or whatever, and vibe coded an application that basically did what he wanted the app to do. And it basically printed out this PDF ultimately and put down all these requirements for whatever it is they're doing. It was a construction project. It was like, we need this here, we need that there. This is the inventory. It printed it all out. And it looked great, cool. I mean, it was emojis everywhere, but what do you expect from a vibe coded project? But yeah, so it had everything in this PDF, and he was like, "This is what we want. This is what we want to build." But he's not going to say, here's the code base, and can you build this, make it functional? He just gave us this output, and we're like, cool, yeah, that's great. My first thought was like, oh, this is terrible. This is a terrible app. And then I'm like, no, you got to get out of that mentality and be like, this is actually great, because not only is he giving us a prototype of exactly what he wants, there's probably a ton of like markdown files and requirement PRDs and things that either he's created or it can create, sort of like a reverse engineer that he can give us. And then we can literally just dump that into our own system and say, hey, this is what we need to build for this little mini application in the app. But obviously sit behind all the guardrails and the rules and the design systems and the things we've already built, so that this can just be its thing.
Yeah.
And that's actually a great way for stakeholders or executives, if they want something, use an AI tool to build it, and then let us have the reverse engineer it.
Yeah, reverse engineer. I mean, it's the thing we, talk about the relationship between what vibe coding creates and the value it creates to a company is like, it's no longer in the building or the building itself, the logic, the process that you use to do the building. That is where all the value now is. The artifact at the end of it is not the value. That's trivially reproducible from the logic. So you get people shifted into that mindset where uh, that I'm there to keep them from going too far, or I'm there to let them go as far as they feel like they're still able to provide input into the direction, and they will eventually run away. I think people, especially people that have been doing this a long time, yeah, you've just been burnt so many times by executives not understanding what a slippery slope is. That the fact that you are getting closer and closer, or you feel like the fact that you feel like you're getting closer and closer to a piece of software that actually runs the organization, that's not actually what's happening. You're just giving a better and better clarity to the prototype of the system you want to build. You're not building it. And I think that's what's difficult for them to understand is what's the difference? Because to them, it's just a computer screen. It's not all the code and the services and the Google clouds and all that stuff that is behind it. They can't see anything. I don't even know that stuff exists.
Yeah.
It's just an HTML page.
Yeah, I know you had a specific example of this cleanup, talking about vibe coding cleanup. You had a specific example about it. I have a specific example about it. So I just thought it'd be fun to just share our specific examples. Why don't you go first? Because you told me there was something you've been called in to fix.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a client real recently that, this is a classic example of having a problem that's very viable, but having that problem at this scale that's not viable, right? So if you're loading a whole bunch of data to a database, then there's a whole lot of work that goes into figuring out the optimum way to go into that database. But that work is very different if you're loading the first 10,000 rows and if you're holding the second billion. It's like those are very, very different. But there's just way fewer examples of code written for loading a billion rows. So if you go into Claude and say, help me load this, even if you tell it there's going to be a billion rows, it doesn't necessarily understand the difference between how it's supposed to build a pipeline at those different scales. And so I think this is not the first and it won't be the last time you go in and it says like, look, I built this, it works. It's just slow. It just takes too long. How do I make it go faster? And it's like, well, you have to redesign the build process because it was built for a scale and that. And so that to me is like kind of thematic way that you'll see people approach this. Is that similar to your answer? Like, are they coming at it from a theme where you're like, I see that?
Well, for me, in the user experience perspective, it was kind of like the CTO had basically he had a bunch of requirements from executives about building this application. And what's cool about it though is it's lots of mini applications, and it's basically replacing a lot of SaaS tools they use. QuickBooks, Salesforce, I don't know, any kind of mailing platform, for like Help Scout or some kind of support system, and scheduling. I mean, gosh, you could reel off there's like 20 applications, right? They're all paying these licenses for. The idea is hire a company to come in, like a team of specialists to come in and vibe code, I hate using that word, to replace all these systems, which are costing thousands and thousands of dollars every month just to build one upfront cost and then build one unified platform. And that was the brief. And then he went ahead and built a lot of the vibe code, basically a bunch of these little mini applications, and created this massive hub for all these different applications. And it's great, right? It works amazing from the front. And then you get in and and that's why I was hired, is like you come in as a user experience designer and engineer, and there's a lot of work to be done. Let's put it that way. And that's great because it means that people like me aren't out of a job. We're not being replaced because AI, like you said, can't go backwards. It can go, here you go, build, 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 build. And it just keeps almost like a tree, just branches just keep on going and going and then building all these amazing functionality. But the client, the end user will come in and go, okay, I don't know what I'm supposed to click on here. I don't know what this navigation has got so many items here. I don't really know where I click. And the AI is going to be like, oh, you click on this. And because it knows, because it has all that context, but the user's like, I don't understand. So yeah, you have to have someone like me come in and say, okay, let's just hide all of that. They're in this team. So all they need to see is literally 3 pages. And then they come in and then there's their experience, So, but the AI isn't going to come back and say that unless you specifically, obviously, prompt it to do so. So that's been an interesting. It's not so much. There's definitely been some cleanup, but I wouldn't say it's like code cleanup. Oh my gosh, it's really terrible code, and the code was actually, I think, probably pretty good. It was just more like things weren't semantically named properly, and there was a lot of inconsistencies. And for me as a designer, I hate it when you've got like navigation items where submit submit buttons should be or cancel buttons. In a form, and there's a nav item there, and that's wrong. And buttons might be gold here, and then they're green there, or success button might have a white border instead of a green border. Things like that, which bug me as a designer. But the AI is just throwing out all these different things, and it's very inconsistent. Lack of design system.
Yeah.
And again, this is probably what you like in your world too. Like, as a data engineer, you build this architecture and these foundations, and you set rules about what you can and can't do, right? On
Yeah.
top of that. Whereas in the design world, it's the same. Like, here's a design system. This, you can't do this. You can do this. You don't have a border radius more than 3 pixels and things like that, right? You set this design system, and then the AI can go, oh, there's the design system. I got to stick to this. And then any other pages it vibe codes from there will be fine because it's following this design system. But that design system still needs to be created in order for the AI to know what it's doing. So yes, there's definitely been some cleanup in this project for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's, I think, a classic example of going too far without taking the time to sort of set a baseline. In one of the projects I'm working on now sort of has a similar, like, just add another site, add another feature. And the same kind of problem kept reasserting itself is no matter how specific you were saying to reference a module or something that exists, you see how many it's the same thing. You are doing something a little bit different, 'cause it is different. But the AI doesn't have a real good sense of that. And so it tends to change things that you didn't want it to change. And every time it does that, it accumulates. And so there's a way to interpret what we're saying. Someone watches this podcast and going like, "Oh, okay. Stu said that, when I see this, then I need to think about, hey, there's 7 pages, but what I need to tell the LLM is I want you to reproduce this with 3 pages." And they'll walk away thinking, "Well, now I don't need somebody like Stu because now I know the trick. Now that I know it's Stu." But what they didn't hear is that, like, that's not the trick. The trick isn't to do that. The trick is to know when to do. The trick is to know how far in the project to get. If you do that after every commit, you're going to be wasting all your tokens. If you never do it, you're going to have a problem. So when? And when is so much about experience. It's so much about I pushed it to this point before and I've gone past this point and I always wish I hadn't. So we should stop and rebaseline. Those decisions you make early on, they can, the same thing in the data. The decisions you make early on with the data will constrain what you can do with the application. It'll also constrain what you do with the user interface of the application. And so even when you come to it and you say, well, there's a different way we can look at it, if that different way of looking at it needs to be reflected in the data, then you got a lot more work to do than if you'd have been able to have that conversation earlier when there were only a couple of modules and the data wasn't quite as fixed as it is now. There would have been much longer to do it. So it's like the longer you let them go before you come in and try to do it towards the problem is, but nobody can actually describe that.
And also, it's another way of looking at it. It's like this. It's like, uh, traditionally you start with all the architecture and you put all these foundations in place, and then you kind of work. That's like a triangle. Then you kind of go down to that point where the
Yeah.
user can use the tip of the triangle. But vibe coding is kind of different. It's the upside down triangle. It's like, I want this, and then build out and sprawl out. So it's kind of flipped. And then you end up with this maze of different things happening in the application. So, but it's quicker. And it's not necessarily quicker because it could actually take longer or the same amount of time. It seems quicker because you're seeing with that reverse triangle, upside down triangle, you're actually seeing the results very quickly. It's actually quite a good analogy because if you think about it, the end users first and they get the design experience first. They're like, oh my gosh, it looks great. They're seeing the end product very quickly. But it isn't the end product. And actually it is, as it grows and as develops and more coding happens and stuff, you end up with this kind of upside down object, which isn't necessarily bad, but but it is faster. Whereas the traditional method, maybe with the engineering, the foundation, the design systems like we just talked about, all that in place first takes a long time to build. But then if you build on top of that, you end up with a much more solid foundation. And then you get, at the end, you get a really solid product, but it takes longer.
But it takes longer. I don't know how well this strategy would work in user interface design, but one thing that's it leaned into that in versions, I like the way you did that upside down triangle, because we started to approach dashboard design a little inverted like that. Whereas dashboard design, you sit down, you got a blank screen, you go, what do you want here? What do you want here? So the new version of it, if you were to sort of, and again, taking the proclivities and tendencies people have when they approach AI, and like leaning into it as an advantage instead of seeing it as a problem to be managed, right? AI can go way farther than you ever want to go with way less effort really quickly. So that's a problem. Well, what if that's the opportunity? What if you intentionally over design everything and you put people in the mode where there's just no cognitive place for them to add, right? Then what do they have left? Subtract. Well, what is subtraction? Simplification. So you're sort of like forcing them into a mode of saying, this is too complicated. We need to simplify this. And that is an easier cognitive leap to tell people now we need to start it over because there is a sense that to simplify something, you have to sort of go back. But to say, I'm trying to push it forward and it's slowing down, and you're coming in and saying you're just observing the velocity and you're saying I want it to move faster, that's very different of a cognitive process. That's like, what's the minimum investment to get it moving faster, as opposed to how do I simplify? And I don't know if it'll work as well in UI design, but it definitely works in dashboards because the whole premise of a dashboard is there's a tremendous amount of information you can throw at any given dashboard. So what's the minimum amount needed for a given decision? And so we would approach that by saying, what is the minimum amount needed for any decision? But now we can approach it by saying, what is every possible thing that could be needed? And have the user go, yeah, I don't care about that. I don't care about that. I don't care about that. And then they're down, they're in. That's what it resolves to, is this core that they really need. So if you have an opportunity approach like that, that would be a good example of like leaning into the proclivity there.
I wonder what these companies that do the vibe coding. I haven't spoken to anyone that does this yet. Have you met anyone like? I mean, I'm wondering what they charge. I'm wondering what
It does
the
vibe coding for a living?
no cleanup.
Oh, cleanup. Yeah, I mean they're closer to like normal rates because I think that the people who work primarily with fingers on keyboards and are thinking about defending that way of life, right? The way this seems like it most justifies that is the idea of cleaning up by hand things that the vibe codes get wrong. And so it makes sense that they would position it like
The
that.
irony of that, though, is they are most definitely using IDEs which have AI integration.
Yeah.
Everyone does now.
Yeah. Which again, it's not the tool, right? But how you approach the market is difficult, is more difficult.
I mean, basically, what you're saying is you're hiring a development agency who've got 20 engineers, senior engineers with 20 years of experience or whatever to come in and clean up your code. And whether they're using AI or not, it doesn't matter because they have
Doesn't matter.
experience, is what you mentioned earlier.
Experience. Yeah. Because you're trusting that they know how to push the ball across the finish line. And you're admitting that at least you've acknowledged not just a matter of vibe coding. So there must be something else to bring into the equation. I feel like people don't really lean into the thing that authentically puts them in the conversation, which is it's not that I have any tricks here. It's when I know how to play them. We all have the same cards, right? There's only 52 cards in the deck. Nobody's making up any new ones, but you can still play a game very differently with those cards. And I think there's a legitimate thing to say that that's where the skill comes in. It's when to apply it, not when
Yeah.
to apply it.
And like one of our first episodes was like, where are all our jobs going? You know, that was when this stuff was all kicking off and everyone was freaking out about losing their jobs. The irony is that like, you know, I saw the other week about how the hirings for design related like UX jobs has gone up actually. And probably, and I think that someone was saying the other day, an engineer was saying that they're desperately trying to find AI experienced the senior engineers to come in and assist with these kind of projects that are coming in that are very complex from an engineering perspective, you know, because you also have AI and vector databases and RAG searching and all this kind of stuff, which are very engineering,
Yeah.
layered things. They're getting hired, you know.
Well, they're all very new technologies. So if you want a certain number of years of experience in something that's only a certain number of years old, then you're basically riding the adoption curve to see when you're going to get developers that claim that as a skill set. Yeah. It's hard, I think, because it's a lot harder to sell that you know when to apply a tool than I've got a secret toolbox that nobody else can use. It's like, you know, if you could buy all professional tools in the black plumbing truck, but you're still sitting there like, yeah, but how do I fix this thing? It's easy to focus on the tools and be mildly dangerously productive with it and think that that's the answer instead of it being more of like an indicator that there's more here than you saw is what that because if you were able to get to the end, then great. That's it. The fact that you didn't means there's more to it. And so I think if you, from a selling, if you're really explicit about what that more is, right? and how you solve that. What that more is, if you keep going with vibe coding, it'll get more and more complicated until you can't add any features anymore. But that has nothing to do with vibe coding. That's true for any project that you just keep adding to, right? It's not necessarily changing that. It's just happening a lot faster, and it's happening to people who haven't been through it before. So it makes sense that you want somebody that's been through it before to tell you whether you're on that road. It's just happening faster. And it's happening faster without a lot of the prerequisites that would open your eyes to that, right? You didn't go through all the small versions of it to say, "Oh, the big version is gonna have this problem." You just went straight to the big version, which if it works, great. It doesn't work that much. And when it does work, it tends to be about things that were already sort of well explored. And so you didn't really add a lot of value in doing that. Value in the sense of like your involvement in it to close the gap, as opposed to your involvement as the person who wrote the prompt, which just isn't as effective as the person who steered it, migrated it, wrote the skills on it, built the application on it, harnessed it, written it. That person's adding a lot of value into the model. But the person that's just open up lovable and make me a to-do clone.
Yeah. So do you think there'll be, what's your thoughts in the next 3 to 6 months in terms of cleanup for vibe coding? Do you think there's going to be less or more, or do you think it's
Oh,
kind of merge
it's
into just,
more. It's just gonna be more. It's just gonna be more and more. I think the only question is gonna be like to what degree do the models kind of keep accelerating? Because every time they take a step forward, they're also able to correct problems from before. You experienced that right here when you were like, "Well, I was in Opus, I got forced to move Sonnet, and it was kind of screwing
yeah,
back to
I was
Opus."
just about to say, it's like, no, every time they bring out a new model now, it kind of gets regressed backwards again because the US government aren't happy about it or something. Well, there's some reason. So it's almost like hitting a wall of like what can be released.
Yeah. Well, see, that's the question is because previously we used to talk about that wall as being a natural consequence of diminishing returns, right? But now it actually seems to be like more of a legislative thing that the government's just going to come down and be like, no, I'm sorry, you can't just do whatever you want with these. And like, will that survive other administrations? It doesn't like it doesn't carry quite as much, but I doubt they're just going to go back to nothing. They'll sort of be like, "Oh, we need a common sense version of this," and then they'll let it up there.
It's
Like
kind of a bummer because I never actually got to try Fable out because on our last podcast,
you're like 3 days, or
it
3 or
came
4
out
days.
while we were doing the podcast. It came out because I was talking about Opus 5, and then you were like, "Oh no, it's called Fable." I was like, "Dang, I didn't even see the announcement." And before I'd even got a chance to look at it the next day, it'd already been pulled, or it'd only been restricted to certain things. And I
Yeah.
was told people had been saying they'd been messing with it. They vibe coded this entire like one shot of whatever for like in like an hour, but it burned all their tokens for the month. And I had a couple of things that I would like to have had it build that I've struggled with Opus, like some animation stuff I've been trying to work on. I was like, I bet you would have nailed that, but I didn't get a chance, unfortunately.
I mean, I think the problem was that they posted a date at which it was gonna be available, and they're like, "It's gonna be available now until the 23rd." And then, and so everybody's like, "Well, okay, I'll wait for the weekend." But then by the time the weekend came around, it was cut off. I touched it. That day it came out just to play or just to see what was going on. It was again, it's hard to know how much better it is till you really get to use it. So I think it was a lot of people's first blush of it, but
And did you ask it the meaning of life, and it told you, right?
I didn't try that part. It's for like you. I had a thorny problem that I was struggling through with Opus, and so I threw Fable.
Well, hopefully someone asked it while it was still around. Hopefully someone asked it what the meaning of life was.
But in terms of trend, right? Like when the models were getting better and better, there was a sense that in startups and in general, so this is a very common thing, is that you just had to wait. And so I vibe coded it. It reached the point of complexity where it maxed out. I can't push it any further. What do I do? Do I hire somebody to rewrite it, or do I wait? And I think people are still a little bit waiting. Doesn't seem like waiting is a good idea anymore. There's lots of signals that say that waiting is not the answer, either from a cost standpoint or from an availability standpoint or an optionality standpoint. Waiting is probably not going to keep getting there for different reasons now than it was, but different reasons, still the same thing. So once people start hitting that wall where it's like, oh, I can. Well, what's the other option? Well, you got to hire somebody. So I think it's like a lot of latent demand building up that's been sort of brushed aside or suppressed a little by the fact that the models have kept getting better.
So basically, to summarize, keep vibe coding because it keeps us in business.
And the only way to know what business there is to be done is to be the one that's using it so you can figure that out. Because those heuristics that you have about at what point do you stop the project and start over again because you need to drastically simplify the architecture. You're going to have to make those decisions in like real time. And you're going to have to do it in software where you don't necessarily understand that it's happening when it's happening, but you still need to be able to make those decisions. And if you're not the one that's feeling that as you go along, then you're just relying on the same age old wisdom that we know isn't going to apply when product is going to get made in hours and implemented in a day, and then you're dealing with the consequences of it. And you're just not going to fit the old way of thinking.
Yeah, but don't be afraid. Mess around, have fun. Like these things are fun.
Right.
They're
Don't be
fun.
afraid. It's not it's not gonna take your job like you think it's gonna take your job. It's not gonna take your job by literally watching what you do and then taking your job. So if you think resistance to it is just not engaging with it, that's not how it works. Like it works by slowly removing the need to do tasks from a wide variety of people so that there are collectively fewer of them needed. It doesn't work on the individual basis and it's not resisted on the individual basis. You have to resist it either organizationally or you have to be one of the ones that's driving it forward so you can take the direction that it's going. The only thing you can't do is not engage with it. 'Cause then you have no stake in the outcome at all.
Yeah. So yeah, as the months progress, we'll see what the cleanup tasks can look like in the next few months. See if it's gonna be more or less. We'll see. But yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll
Cheers, guys.
see you next time.